Welcome to the Brilliant Fertility Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katie Rose, and this podcast exists to help illuminate the path ahead of you. With expert interviews, clinical pearls, and real client success stories, my intention is to bring you hope for what's possible on this journey and to give you tools and resources to navigate the ups and downs on the road before you. If you find this podcast helpful, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite listening platform. And I have a big request. If you have a minute, can you leave us a 5-star review? And let us know, what did you learn? What did you come away with? Did you leave with that spark of hope? This helps more people like you find the podcast. My mission is to support as many humans as possible on their path to become parent. And by you sharing and subscribing, you're part of that mission too. And I'm so grateful for you for being here. Welcome back to the Brilliant Fertility Podcast, everyone. I am so beyond excited. I don't know if there is a word that can quite describe how I feel about doing this interview today, but I have Dr. Julie Vaughn with us. She's a Manhattan-based holistic doctor specializing in fertility, and she is the author of one of my favorite books for fertility called Spiritual Fertility. Dr. Julie, thank you so much for being here. And I mean, I'm kind of having like a little fangirl moment of like full circle, like 5 years ago from when I first found your book. So welcome to the podcast, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Katie. I'm honored. Thank you, and I love that. I believe that the book Spiritual Fertility that I was fortunate enough to be able to share and that Hay House helped support. I wrote this in the book, but I feel it even more now with some years past, that it was really a transmission, and so beautiful when you actually make a piece of art or a book and put it out into the world, because it truly has its own life. It has its own being after that. And so while I do feel like very proud of it and defined by it in some ways, I also, it's kind of nice to like let it sit back and let it do its own thing like a child once it's, doing its own thing and growing, and it's have something to do with it, but so much of it is about its own soul and path. So I'm thankful that you found it.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I don't know if I've told you that like my path to being led to that book. So I'll just let our listeners know, because I feel like it really was divinely led, and it was a really important piece of me expanding my practice to incorporate more of the spirituality. It was something that I like intuitively knew it needed to be more of the conversation for years, but I was also like, ooh, like, am I the right person to be having these conversations with people? And so I'd had a patient who'd had a miscarriage in late 2019, early 2020, and it just rocked me in a way that no other patient's loss had before. I've worked in this world long enough. There's going to be tragedies. There's going to be losses. And for whatever reason, that one hit me harder. And I was pretty much just grieving in bed for a couple of days, and happened to be on a group call with all these like brilliant practitioners all over the country in this mastermind where we were having sort of a fun call with a person who was a business intuitive and was just kind of, doing some fun exercises with people. But she got to my energy and she was like, whoa, what's happening over there? And I let her know that I was just feeling really heartbroken. And she said, I am being guided to tell you to, go down the path of looking at spirituality. And she first introduced me to the book Spirit Babies, and I gobbled that up in about a half a day. And then thankfully Amazon was like, if you liked that, you might like this Spiritual Fertility. And I was like, I am all over it. And I found that one, that this book that you put out here was so comforting to my soul. And I loved that it was not just about mediumship or, giving readings. It's giving people the tools themselves to learn how to connect to their intuition and to be able
Yeah.
to connect to the spirit of their future children or
Yeah.
the spirits of, babies who maybe had needed to be a human form for a moment.
Sure.
I just thought it was absolutely brilliant, and it has changed my practice
Oh,
immensely.
thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. See, it's the principles of attachment theory and parenting. You put all your love unconditionally into a child or something, and then you release it. And because it has those foundations, it has the ability to go on and do what it needs to. Right. So
Yeah,
I'm
and that's
glad. I think it was very challenging to put a lot of my story into it, but yet I also knew that that's authenticity is so essential in the work of the healing space. And I think, we've talked about before how as healers, it's like no one really is really drawn to work with you unless you actually yourself have been through things that a person without even speaking can kind of feel in their bones or in their cells, if you will, that there's a space that you can sit with them. And what I think is so, as you mentioned, the returning to people's own unique experience of intuition, that to me is something that I feel is essential in the space of fertility and also one of the opportunities. It's tricky to, when you have this great desire, real want to have children, and then it's not happening, when you want to. As we talked about, this massive window of healing opens up in that space. And that's one of the reasons I love working in fertility, is because of this opportunity that people will walk into to really look at and talk about and sort of like clear the decks or do work that they necessarily might not do other times of their life, that's not as important. So I think of it as, I love the sitting with people in those spaces, and I love the complexity of what's going on and the opportunity and like the real discussions that happen, the real human stuff that happens in that space, where we're not just like, you know glazing over all of the grief or the sadness, where we have a chance to actually share that together instead of, how was your day? Oh, it's fine. As we actually get to talk about all of the sides and aspects of being a human being, which is so important in that journey to parenthood, because there's so much that does come up once you do become a parent in that space.
yes, this is like a great preparation for the challenges that are just innately part of parenthood. It doesn't matter, how
Mhm.
long you wanted a baby, how much it took to get there. It's going to pose its own challenges, and children are our greatest mirrors. And if we have unhealed things, oh boy, does that get brought up in parenting.
That's right.
And so what I'm curious about is, you've mentioned unconditional love a couple times in relation to the book, but
Mhm.
this is also such a cornerstone of your practice in helping people navigate their fertility journey. And what does that mean to bring unconditional love into this space?
Yeah. Well, there's two things. Having been fortunate enough to do this work for 20 years now, and having been asked this question for some time about, like, what is fertility, what is the most, what to do, like, tell me what to do, like, what is the answer here in this space. And I really have distilled it down into just two kind of actionable or non-actionable, if you'll take more of a Zen approach to it. But I say to people when they ask me this question, I say the best fertility medicine in the universe to me is managing and healing to the best of your ability, identifying, managing, and healing to the best of your ability, trauma, wounds, whether it be transgenerational or wounds from this lifetime, to the best of your ability. It doesn't mean it doesn't need to be perfect. Just, however you interact with it. And the second is unconditional love. And that unconditional love space is, when I say that to people, they're like, what do you mean exactly? And then we'll start talking a little bit more about like what's going on for them in the moment. So take, for instance, someone I work with who is sort of on the clock with their fertility journey for whatever reason, be it the kind of narrative that they believe from the biomedical system, cultural system, or from a desire base, like a space that's opened up in their life, or a new love that they found, or, and all of a sudden time comes in and the constraints of our ideas of time come in, which is always has some conditionality to it. When we're thinking about when I want something, I want it now, or I want it at 10 p.m. tonight, or like, I want to go to that yoga class on Thursday at 7. Like there's want and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's good. But when we're talking about communing with energies that aren't yet ruled by this sort of chronological Julian calendar that we've tapped into, like our little digital times and calendars, how do we then switch over into an idea of removing the conditionality into, okay, let me release that into acceptance. Let me release the specifics, the conditions into receptivity and openness. There's a lot of examples of how this can happen. This also can happen through self-love and self-acceptance along the journey, like unconditional love for yourself and the journey in life that you've had that led you to the moment of being in the space of opportunity then. The challenge for a lot of people in that space of loving unconditionally is a lot of times related to their own conditional love for self, or that they were given as children. A lot of those parameters that we grew up with from our family, or our culture or school, then kind of can easily translate into our experience of going into becoming parents. And because all of my work at the end of the day is about balancing the endocrine system. Essentially I teach the tools of the spiritual. I teach the tools of managing and healing trauma to help bring people back into a sort of regulation, that one little piece to kick things into, okay, my animal body, my spirit, the trauma patterning and my gray matter up here, all the things are now sort of, I've dealt with the components enough for it to click into openness, receptivity to that cosmic timing and plan. So then it's allowed to happen in a different way than the idea of, well, I want it now. My friend Anya is actually wonderful. I had a conversation with her so long ago, and she's just one of my most brilliant friends. Like, she has something to say about everything. She's just one of those folks. And we're talking about fertility, and she was like, did you know that they did this cultural anthropological study in the 1960s and showed me all this data about, like, when you asked a woman in an elevator, for instance, in the 1960s, how many children she was going to have, the response in general was, God knows. Who knows? God knows, right? And just the switch from the 1960s to the 1980s with the distribution of birth control and choice to now with reproductive medicine and freezing of eggs, like the concept then of like, how then are we involving our nervous system and our brain and all of the patterning that comes in with that in the choice of when we're going to become parents. So there, that shift in itself is one we haven't had time to adapt to in our animal bodies as humans. So, but we also are these frontier people in this space because, whoa, we're actually changing paradigms and shifting narratives and redefining what will be going forward. So it's that unconditional love piece is just so much of a something to carry with you and remember whenever you start to feel this sort of shame or guilt or worry or fear that pulls us into contraction and also pulls us into, well, if it doesn't happen by Thursday, then I'm going to give up. Or, I'm never ever, I'm never ever going to do IVF. I've heard from so many people. And then they're like, let's work on that a little bit. Like, let's talk to me about those beliefs around that. Like, and, and then it's like, oh, what if we switch this piece and this piece? It's like, yeah, actually, if I need to, I will. Like, that's fine. It's like, how do you start to change with the places of contraction? And sometimes just that's the secret sauce, the magic to help everybody get pregnant.
Huge. Yeah. And even, just, practicing through your work, in the book with the golden passport and feeling into what does contraction feel like? What does expansion feel like? And being able to ask better questions of like when we feel contracted around something. So someone maybe initially heard IVF or egg donor and they just shut down. Everything was contracted, just getting curious about like, well, what does occur to you when that happens? Does it feel like a moral failing and you're making all these beliefs about yourself come to the surface? And so really seeing like, well, these are, again, opportunities for healing. It's opportunities for seeing like, where are we potentially creating our own blocks? And maybe I don't love the word blocks because it's really more of just like a curtain. It's like we just can pull back the curtain. It can be gentle. It's not like a concrete road. And this idea that how we were shown love, and maybe not just by parents, but other, society, other caregivers, teachers, how we were told our lives were meant to look like. It doesn't necessarily have to be this big capital T trauma, but it can be these accumulation of micro traumas or generational, maybe not something that happened directly to us, but it happened to a grandparent or a parent. And now the patterning, the ways of being that have been carried through our generations, like how does that impact someone who might be struggling to conceive now?
It's a great question. And as you know, because you are a seasoned practitioner yourself, it's very relative to the person, right? It's very unique journey. And going back to the advocacy and touching base, always going back to what's true for you as an individual, what feels expansive, what feels harmonious with your intuition, not a no, but a yes. Essentially, after kind of going back for a second into sort of how I got to my current theory and practice kind of pillars, is there's a lot of, we'll go back even further as I talk about in my book. I was born and raised the daughter first of a colonel in the Army, even born at West Point, and my dad was the youngest company commander in Vietnam, just like straight arrow war hero. And then he retired when I was 5 and became a Southern Baptist preacher and missionary. So I was raised in a space of a lot of authority and also an idea of a sort of hierarchical power system, very male-based too. And even more within that, I was raised in a sort of understanding of the idea of like that individuals or gurus or people can hold power that can be kind of transmitted to you, that there's other people who have more power or more access than you do. And I felt that myself in my own healing journey as a child growing into a teenager, looking for answers for my own disease and unwellness. And I remember the feeling of really wanting to find somebody who could just fix it or take it away. That there was somebody out there that just had the answer or could. And I pursued going to all kinds of doctors and shamans and holistic doctors and Western doctors, and the system of like holistic medicine, even still for a lot of people, mirrors this idea that somebody else has the answer out there, that you can go and find a guru who knows more than you do. You can go and find one specific person who will tell you the specifics of your spirit baby and the timing, and that will be the answer. For me, after practicing for a while in the style of not being, I've always been very critical of this idea. I'm very anti-guru in that sense. I'm very anti-authoritative power structure as far as somebody else out there knows more than you do. To me, like that's the essence of really, and this I share this with all my clients when they're talking about like figuring out who to work with, which doctors, which other therapists, which healers. I say, do they support, when you step back, the way they work with you? Are they supporting your own autonomy? Are they supporting the way that you are getting clearer and clearer in how you can listen to what you want? Are they holding the space for you to speak, even if you're in disagreement or questioning or don't know? Like, find the people to work with who do that. And those are the healers for you. Not the ones that have some sort of quick fix answer out there or hold some secret message or door to open and walk through. And I mention this because I think in this space of fertility, people are vulnerable.
Absolutely.
They're vulnerable, and on many levels, financially, in their relationship, in their identity. And so, and also then if you bring in just the craziness of hormones, it's a whole other level of vulnerability. And our uteruses, which have always been vulnerable, but it's like are going through even more on the political stage, on the global stage. So I feel that when we're talking about supporting people and just what feels like this knowing and this ability to find more regulation for themselves in their nervous systems, in their emotional bodies. For me, like that's the most beautiful part of fertility work, is that you see then it's not just people getting pregnant, you see them also having tools to going into parenthood, which they're going to need. So, it's just like that to me is sort of the ethical and important part of taking the time and doing the work of spiritual fertility along the conception journey. And it's not just about conception either. I mean, those are the tools that I apply to all healing.
Yeah, it's life. It's life. We
Yes.
can't control so many things in life, fertility being one of them.
That's
And
right.
there's, pandemics and political upheavals and natural disasters. And I mean, there's just so many other opportunities for resourcing when life is hard. So the ripple effects of this type of work, even though, it may have been infertility that created the window, the ripple effects into all other areas of life can be really profound when you're willing to take on this opportunity. I hate to call it work. I mean, it is kind of, it's not always like the easiest of ways of being. And I appreciate when you kind of mentioned like, it's not really doing, because we almost want to pull back from all the doing. Because in my mind and in my experience, like when people are coming and looking for the fixes, they're already doing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
doing
Mm-hmm.
maybe part of the doing and the, constant checklist and the constant researching is part of what is keeping them in this dysregulated state.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to
Mm-hmm.
and gather their own ways of connecting to their intuition allows them more space for being.
Yep, that's well said. It's well said. Yeah, and yes. And it does bring up this idea because for a lot, it's not even all of us are connected to our intuition. It's just how well do we express it or believe it or share it. I always love the work of Sonia Choquette,
Yeah.
who wrote Trust Your Vibes and the Sixth Sense. And she's an amazing, powerful author. And she's been doing the work for a very long time, actually. And I love when I studied her work, when I got her books a long time ago, I really love the way she put it very similarly. Like she is powerful, intuitive, and psychic, and she's got some family lineage for that. But she also says, hey, like everybody can do this.
Yeah.
You can do this is you too. It's the sixth sense. It's not specific or special to me. It's also something that you can practice and learn and exercise that muscle. So it can be very different though. I mean, it's easy enough said, oh, I have an intuition, something about, well, actually, this is we talked another time about human design, right? Which is,
Mm-hmm.
I've studied so many systems at this point in my life, and I finally dove into the human design from a friend of mine, Becca. And we were talking about the difference in human design between like the splenic intuition and then like the emotional intuition. And it's so interesting how there can be these, and I love the way she described it, which was sort of like one comes like a lightning bolt. Like you turn the corner and you're like struck by an intuition. And it's like, right, I need to do that. I need to call this person. I need to go there. I need to move away from this table. I need to not go on. And these are the kind of things that are coming from a very, and then there's like a emotional intuition, which is something's not sitting with your gut right. Or it's like, it's a mixture of your wisdom and experience in life, but also with a sort of like something in your senses or in your sort of internal compass. It's like something's not quite. So it's also interesting to think about differentiating intuition too, and like
Yes.
what piece in my book I write, sometimes it's really hard to differentiate like fear from intuition, because sometimes fear is the very thing that's getting in the way of us trusting our intuition.
Yes. And yes,
right,
fear is also a compass. Like it's not this black, white, good, bad, right? I find that just getting curious around it and noting like, well, is that fear really ours? Did it come from somewhere else? Was it a societal fear that was placed on us, or is it something that really is coming internally and giving us a direction that is meant to be listened to? And it's not just this black or white. And I think if we know ourselves, and if we, I think human design is fascinating, and being a natural skeptic, which I think is hilarious, that it's like one of my lines in human design is the line of the skeptic. I really like squinty eye looked at human design as like, I don't know about this shit. Like,
I love that that's always a bit of your narrative with everything, because it actually makes you a good scientist though. Like it makes you a really curious healer and practitioner who doesn't just trust the system. And I love that about you. I love your skepticism. And I love that you also like laugh at it and move beyond it too. Like, but it's a real tool for you. Like it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't you're perfect in your design.
And we all are. And that's
we all are.
The thing about, like, I have found that particular system to be incredibly useful, not only for me, but if I happen to be able to gather that information about my clients and be able to give them the resourcing for knowing what is their way of making decisions that feels good for them, and how can we give them more empowerment, circling back to with healers and gurus or practitioners or whoever might be on the fertility team, how are they empowering you?
Mm-hmm.
If there is
Mm-hmm.
a system that can empower you to know yourself better,
Yeah,
again, that's going to serve in so many areas of life.
that's right. That's right. It's true. And I mean, there's almost like a really practical, applicable for all your listeners and viewers is like one of the easiest, because that can be a little bit overwhelming. How do you know that? But it's actually becomes, there's some pretty easy ways to determine that as well. And it's a lot of that, it is like the golden passport, basically, that, which is one of the first practices in my book, which is just about exercising and practicing in your daily life this muscle about not before you get into that practitioner's office or doctor's office, or as you're entering into a chat room or having a conversation with a good friend who has all of this advice about what you should do for fertility. If you in your day-to-day life practice this idea of golden passport work, which is like, what feels expansive to my nervous system, what feels contracted. And it doesn't have to be about these big things. It can start really small too. Like, I have this 45 minutes free right now. I think week before last, I went to Maine for the 4th of July week. I have a lot of responsibility in life. I usually have quite a lot to do. And I had a kind of afternoon where I set aside, we had great, my kid had stuff busy and everybody was doing things, and I was going to sit down at the table and get some work done. And all of a sudden I was like, you better practice what you preach, Julie. You better practice what you preach, because it's like, it is one of my belief systems that when I am listening to that voice, that everything else will be more fluid, will be more in alignment. That when I'm acting more from contraction, I'm usually acting from trauma, I'm usually acting from voices of stress, both societal or maybe from my own memory. So anyway, I ended up just going. There was this beautiful porch of this Airbnb with sunshine and Maine and light. And I just rested my body down on this porch in the sunlight. And I just like meditated for like 2 hours straight in just like the most beautiful, serene environment with ease. And I got up and I started to feel that little guilt come in. And I was like, it's enough. It's going to be fine. And it's like that helped me yesterday when I was in a conflict here in New York City, trying to where I was being questioned, where I was having a hard time deciding what to do. That resource of that time was like, no, I know what I think. I know what I feel. I just spent 2 hours with her in the sun, in the quiet of Maine.
Yeah.
So there are challenges, and it is harder sometimes than others, especially in our family relationships, in our partnerships, and war with authorities. It's harder to stretch that.
It is.
I guess it's sort of a core of unconditional love too. We have to come back to.
And when you talk about like meditating in the sun for 2 hours, and oh goodness, it's been a journey of about the last 5 years for me as well. But when you feel that, like, oh, it would feel so good to do that. But then there's that little narrative in the background of like, but you should do this. You have to do this. If you do that, you haven't done enough. You're not enough. Like, what are those? And I do like to give people practices that will stretch them a little bit to bring those voices forward. What has potentially unconscious, but driving them to act the way they act and do the habits they have. And when you leaning on, well, if nothing bad could happen, if everything could go the way you want it, if you could have the perfect day, like what would that look like? And when you think about having that day, when you think about spending that 2 hours just meditating in the sun and just throwing your to-do list in the trash, what comes up?
Mm-hmm.
What are those,
Yeah,
what part of your brain want to,
totally.
right?
Absolutely. And this is absolutely. And this is like, it's applicable in fertility, because I know also your viewers are like, but how can I do this right now? And I was in my book, I have the story of a really beautiful person I was lucky enough to work with on her first round of IVF, her second round. And she had been on a journey and did all of these sort of like beautiful, holistic, and integrative medicine practices around the IVF. Changed a lot of her diet, changed her job, and like it all felt really good for her. Like it was all expansive. Like it was changes she needed to make, in other words. She started making art again, et cetera, et cetera. So a year and a half later, she comes back to me and she's like, Dr. Vaughn, I'm doing everything that I did before for the first pregnancy that was successful. And I've just come back and I've got like, things aren't working, but I'm doing everything the same as I had done before. What's going on? And I was like, let's go back to our golden passport though. Like, how does it feel when you leave? Or you're driving to acupuncture across town, because that's the only person who specializes in it. How does it feel when you're, making the smoothie every morning, or looking at and doing this group? And it's just like, contract. I don't have time for it. I don't want to do it, but I should be, right? So there's something wrong with me. And is there something more that you'd rather be doing? She's like, honestly, I'd rather be like, use that time to like go to the playground or the beach with my daughter, because I love that. And I said, well, that's the answer then. It's not about, it's always going to be the space of now, in the present, what feels good. And it's never going to be the sort of, these are the things that I have to check off in order to do it, unless it really feels like it is.
Yes. And it can change with different seasons.
Exactly.
Really highlight just because that was where your energy was required 2-3 years ago. We're in a different now. And that's okay.
Exactly. And that's okay. Exactly. Yeah. But again, it's like, that's a part of really how much more availability of like self-compassion and gentleness is there in that space, versus more guilt or feeling bad about yourself because you didn't do the things right, So
I think this will probably give our listeners a lot to be with. And I highly recommend, for those of you listening, if you have not already read Spiritual Fertility, which I know if you've been in my world for a while, I've probably already recommended it to you, but I highly recommend that you take a read of this book. And
thanks, Kate.
And Julie, how can people find you if they feel called to work with you?
Mm-hmm. The audio book for Spiritual Fertility will be out in the fall, finally, which I know a lot of people have been asking for some time. But I can be found at drjulievaughn.com. And on my website, there are quite a few resources. I do see people in person in New York City, sometimes in New Mexico, and I do also have once a year or so retreat work. This next one's in October at Esalen, Big Sur, called Moon Lodge. It's a women's empowerment group for the weekend with my co-leader, Lucia Haran. Beautiful experience. I love it. And then I also offer virtual sessions online too. So a lot of ways to work with me if you're so called to do so. And I, as you know, Katie, like I don't hold back. As soon as I share everything I have. So, if your golden passport says it feels expansive to do so, you're going to get a lot of information when you work with me, and hopefully a lot of tools to help, figure out what's next on your journey. So.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Julie. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your book. Thank you for giving people permission to be and be present and explore themselves and love themselves unconditionally and heal. Your work has been so meaningful for me, and I'm so happy to share it.
Well, I love your work too. And I think one of the reasons I'm here is because I find it to be so in alignment and so ethical in all of the things I just talked about. So I ditto. Yeah.
I would hug you so big.
I know.
Right now.
Thanks, Katie.
You're welcome. All right. For our listeners, we'll have all of Julie's links in the show notes, a link to the book and her website where you can read up on how to work with her. And you can find us on Instagram at Dr. Katie Rose and Julie at Dr. Julie Vaughn. And feel free to reach out to either one of us if you have other questions about this interview or comments, or there's more in this vein that you are so curious about learning from.